In today's video, I have a simple acrylics landscape for you. It's suitable for complete beginners. Welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, my name is Michelle, and on this channel we look at all things watercolour as well as drawing, mixed media videos like this one, even some business and motivation for artists too. Please do consider subscribing. If you click the bell icon, you can get notified every time I have a new video for you. Make at least one free video a week here on YouTube on a Thursday with extra content for Patreon subscribers. So I've recently made a video all about the differences between watercolours and acrylics, and if you're completely new to acrylic painting, then do have a look at that one as well. I'll leave a link to that in the description of this video. I'll also leave details of how you can get hold of the photograph that I'm working from. I'm also going to place it in my Facebook group, so if you go along to my Facebook group, you'll find a folder in the albums that's full of photographs that I use for my YouTube tutorials. I'm going to walk you through every stage of this really simple landscape. We're going to be working on a box canvas, just a standard one that you can buy quite cheaply from any shop where you can buy art materials. So without further ado, let's point the camera downwards and get started. So let's look at the materials we'll be using. I've put some old magazine paper down. So acrylic paints, unlike watercolours, don't always come off of surfaces easily, particularly not plastic or painted surfaces, so be careful of that. I've also got some paper towel here that I can dry my brush on. I've got more than one water jar and I'll be changing those regularly. I've got a photograph that I'm going to loosely be working from. I've got some ceramic dishes for mixing my colours in. Again, you don't want to use plastic for acrylics because plastic palettes can actually bond to your acrylic paints. I mean, it kind of depends what they're made of. Some of them, the acrylics will come off fine, but some of them they won't, so I wouldn't take the risk. You can use a ceramic palette or some dishes like this, or you can simply use a dinner plate, but do make sure it's white. You don't want coloured ceramic ware because it'll put your colour mixing off. I've got a selection of brushes here. Some of these are acrylic brushes. I've got a few watercolour brushes as well, but they're not my most favourite or my newest watercolour brushes. They're just some old brushes. Because I'm a watercolourist at heart, I tend to go towards watercolour brushes when I'm putting small details on acrylic paintings, but that's totally a matter of personal choice. At the very least, you want some brushes like this with a bit of a point, and you want one or two sort of flat brushes. I've got one here called a filbert, which is a flat brush with a round end. That can be quite nice for acrylic painting as well. I've got sort of a fan brush here that I've cut into and made it a bit ragged. Quite nice for foliage, but not a necessity for starting painting. You can start acrylic painting with just one brush. Finally, I've got my paints. So I've been sent a selection of paints here from Jackman's Art Materials, who I work with. One of them is just handwritten because it's just a manufacturer's sample. They obviously didn't have the label ready for this one yet. It's quite a limited palette. I've got black and white. You will always need those when you're acrylic painting, at least you'll certainly need white. I've got an emerald green. This has got two pigments written on it, so it's a mixed colour. I've got French ultramarine, I've got naphthol red, I've got titanium white, lemon yellow, diarylide yellow and carbon black. Now I would ideally like something like a phthalo blue, because if you look at the sky here, it's quite a turquoise colour, and we've got an ultramarine here, but we're just going to make do, and I'm just going to adjust it and see what I can get going on. This photograph has come out a little bit more yellow and a little bit lighter than it was in reality. I have terrible problems with my printer. It prints everything too dark, so I kind of have to up the light levels and then they can come out too light, but it's good enough for what I need. If you want a better version of it, you'll find that in my Facebook group. So these are the materials, and next we're going to look at applying paint and an underdrawing. So I'm starting just with a ready prepared box canvas, such as you can buy from any art suppliers, and we're going to go straight in on top of it. Of course, if you were painting in acrylics more regularly, you might have your own prepared canvases, you might have your own favourite way of preparing the canvas, but we're just going to keep it simple for beginners in this video. Now I could start with an underdrawing. Certainly pencil will work on this canvas. I could draw my picture in pencil, and then I could put sort of a watered down layer of paint on top, and that would show through. But this is such a simple landscape. I think I'm actually going to, in this case, draw with a fine brush and just draw straight on to the canvas in paint. However, I want to put an undercoat on this canvas first. I want to put an underneath colour. This is quite important with acrylic painting. It generally speaking, of course, you know, somebody will point out some artist that makes it work, but generally speaking, it doesn't look good for the canvas to be showing through the paint, for there to be little gaps here and there. So it's a good idea to knock it out with an undercoat of paint. Now, what colour do you use? That's really up to you. You could use, for instance, for this painting here, you could use something like a light grey and get a very natural, very muted look. You could use, you know, an acid yellow or a bright pink and end up with something quite modern looking, because some of those little bits of paint will often show through towards the end, depending how many layers you put on. I actually rather fancy going for something like a lilac, because there are hints of lilac in the sky at the back here, and I think if those showed through, they make a nice contrast as well with this yellow green in the front. So I'm going to mix up a lilac colour and I'm going to apply it over this canvas. Now the rule with acrylics like oils is fat over lean. Now somebody said in the comments a week or so ago, well, that isn't really a thing with acrylics because they don't crack. But actually, just, you know, the practicalities of building up layers of paint would say that you want the thicker layers on top. You also have to be careful with acrylics that you don't put too much water in, because that can affect the integrity of the paint. In other words, the chemical composition of the paint of those acrylic binders can actually be broken down by putting too much water in. However, if you are working on watercolor paper, because of its absorbency, you can add a bit more water to your acrylics. But if you're working on canvas or mixed media paper or some other non-absorbent surface, then you need to make sure that the paint is movable but not too thin. So I've squeezed out a nice lot of white paint here. I've also got a little bit of blue and red on hand, so I'm just going to mix enough water into that to get it a little bit mobile, and then I'll just pick up a touch of blue and we'll mix in from there. So a touch of blue and a touch of red, and I should start getting that lilac colour that I want. Bear in mind that acrylics, unlike watercolours, can dry a little bit darker. I may even need to mix up more paint, so I'm going to add in some more white. And here you see straight away why we get through so much white paint when we're acrylic painting, because unlike watercolours, you can't really rely on water to completely thin down the paint if you want it to remain of a high integrity and not compromise those acrylic binders. So again, I'm going to put a little bit of the red in and a little bit of the blue and just mix like this. Now acrylic paint dries out very quickly, so you want to get on fast, and I'm just going to start applying this colour and just see how it looks really. So they're quite happy with that. It's not a whole deal darker than the surface it's going onto, but I just want to get rid of that white canvas to start with. So of course I ran out of paint because I haven't worked in acrylics for ages. I forgot how much you have to mix up, so I've mixed up some more. You can see that it's a different colour. I've gone slightly darker down here, which I'm absolutely happy with because it's going to be going underneath the grasses and the foreground, so it doesn't need to be as light as in the sky. Now acrylics are fairly opaque, so it doesn't really matter, you know, you'll be able to cover everything up anyway. You've seen, because it's wet here, one colour has just blended nicely into another, and that's something you can do just like with watercolours. One colour will blend into another if they are wet, but you're going to have a lot less time to do it than with watercolours. I'm also going to take this paint in a moment around the edges of the canvas. I hate to see bare edges on box canvas. In fact, when I was running exhibitions, I pretty much banned such things. So you have choices with the edges of your canvas. You can just take the paint naturally around the edge as you're working, or you can go quite neatly on afterwards and paint a separate colour, or just something, you know, that tones nicely with the other colours that you've used. I'm just going to continue some of this paint around the edge. Now, really important as you finish each colour that you give your brush a clean. You can also stand your brushes in the water to keep them wet while you're working, but really don't do that for very long at all. It's not good for your brushes. Even though acrylics are a bit tougher than watercolour brushes and won't bend instantly, you do risk the handles and all the glue being damaged by soaking in water. But don't let your brush dry with acrylic paint on like this, because it will stay there pretty much permanently. It's really hard to get out. At this point, I just want to make sort of a bit of a neutral colour in order to have something to draw with, as it were. I'm really drawing with my paintbrush. So I've just put some green out on my palette, and green and red are opposite colours, so you should end up with some kind of brown or grey. I've mixed a bit of the blue in there as well. I'm going to put a bit more water in this and water it down a little bit more, make a puddle of that paint, and then I'm going to go in and use my brush just to draw the outline of my landscape. So I'll just be placing this on the table in front of me and looking at where, you know, main elements come. Look at this little hill sort of starts down the bottom here, and just be using this to start sketching an idea of how I want my landscape to look. I'm only using this as a rough guide today, but I thought it was quite a nice simple composition. So again, you know, I can just put the other hill coming along here, and then we've got some trees, and let's put one in around here. So I'm just getting an idea of where these will sit on the paper, keeping those lines broken so that if any of them are showing through later on, they won't look too noticeable. And then just getting an idea of these distant hills in as well. I've got some lines of grasses coming down here. It's really as much as I need to do just to give me an idea of where things are going to sit. At this point in the video, if you're enjoying this video, if you're getting some value from it, could I please ask you to click that thumbs up, that like button, please? YouTube rewards channels with audience interaction, so if you can like, share, subscribe, or leave me a very nice comment, YouTube will push this video out to more people, and I can help more people learn to paint and draw and make more videos for you. So let's see what we can do about mixing this sky colour. So I've got some of the ultramarine here. As I said, I would normally use something like a phthalo for this, but we've got what we've got. So I've put a bit of white in there as well and some water, and I'm just going to put a little bit of the yellow in it. So you don't want to turn it green, but we're just going to try and get a little bit more of that turquoisey blue going on there. And just mixing and mixing and mixing. It's never going to go very bright like the one in the picture, and that is because there's always a touch of red in ultramarine. So in order to get that bright blue sky, we would need a cerulean, a phthalo, something like that, but we'll make do with what we've got. I'm going to squeeze out more white on the side as well, and we're just going to go in and start blending as we go. Now I feel I've added a little too much water there, which is why it's gone a bit streaky. So let's put a bit more blue out and a bit more white. Do remember whilst you're working as well to replace the lids on your acrylic paint. It's not like watercolour, it's not going to stay wet. If it dries in the tube, you're going to find it unusable. And unlike watercolour, you can't just fish it out of the tube and use it from hard. It won't dissolve once it's gone hard. So let's pop that in there. And let's get some down here as well. As I said, completely the wrong blue. So if you're having a go at this painting and you have a set of acrylics, do use a phthalo instead. Just adding a bit of white there. I feel actually that I may add the white clouds almost as a separate layer there. But I am also going to blend with white as I come lower down. I'm trying to keep this sky fairly smooth, because apart from the clouds, it is actually a fairly smooth sky. And going to add some more white as we come down. Oh, picked up some green there. You'll notice that I'm keeping the marks horizontal, and this is important for skies and landscapes. You want to default to horizontal marks, and then, you know, if anything is left with a bit of a brush stroke in, shall we say, then you will still get that realistic look. So I'm quite happy with that first application of sky there. As I said, it's completely the wrong colour, but that's just because I only have ultramarine. So I think what we're going to get is actually quite a different version of our photograph, somewhat of a more stormy approach. Now I've put a bit of green out and mixed with some white and a little water. I'm also going to get a little bit of that sort of dull colour that we had, just to cool this down a little bit, and these are going to be for the distant hills. So we're just putting on base layers at the moment, so we're not going for too much detail at all, but I can just start sort of blocking out some areas, because as you can see, with the paint being quite opaque, you're going to end up losing those initial drawn lines. So it's really helpful to sort of start blocking out areas of colour so you can really work up from there and start putting detail in later on. I'm just going to work across this part here, going in with some white, because the hills seem to sort of more or less disappear behind the trees there. So just keeping that really light. Oh, we've got a bristle there. In fact, we've got several. This is a very cheap paintbrush that I haven't used before. I think we're going to ditch that one, and I'll go into this one here, which is more of a watercolour paintbrush. Although I don't find this filbert shape to be particularly useful for watercolour painting. I'm not quite sure why people bother with them for watercolours, but nevertheless, it's not bad for acrylics. Finally, adding more yellow here, and I can now get a much brighter yellow-green. Again, this is just an underpainting for what we'll be putting on top later on, but I'm already quite liking the results. So I hope you can see at this point where I've picked up multiple colours on my brush at the same time and just allowed things to blend together. I've also gone around the edges of the canvas, so you can see that I've just taken the paint around the edge, not necessarily the exact same colour, but roughly, and I'll continue to do that as I go through the painting so that we don't have that sort of unfinished look around the edge of the canvas. I'm going to allow this to dry for a few minutes now. It'll dry really, really fast. I want it to be a bit drier before I go in and start building up proper details. So I've had a bit of a clean up and I've put some fresh paint out. What I want to do now is to start on the lower part of the sky. I've gone back to rather a scruffy watercolour brush. I do tend to default to watercolour brushes just because that's what I'm used to painting with, and I like the softness of them, but you know, there is no right or wrong brush. You can use either. And I'm just going to start getting some of these lighter areas here. I've got some lemon yellow in here, and just blending upwards with that. A touch of water on it just to help it blend, because we need to lighten this lower part of the sky. Remember, you're not just dealing with the paint that you put on, you're also picking up any damp paint that's underneath, and also if the paint is watered down, you will actually see the colour underneath as well. So you may need to build this up a little bit. Once we come over to this side, I want to get some more sort of lilac-y colours, so I'm going to mix a bit of the blue and a bit of the pink and just get some more of that lilac going in there. I feel there's too much green in this at the moment, and again I need to put more white out. You can see why they sell acrylic paint in such huge tubs, particularly the white. So I'm just blending here. I don't want to cover up all of the initial sky that I made because I actually quite like it, but I just want to, as I said, get those lighter areas working down the base. If it starts to go green like this, it means that it's either picking up the blue underneath or it's just showing through blue underneath, so that means you might just need to add a little more white or allow it to dry and put another layer on top. I'm just going to go on top with a bit of white with a bit of pink in, because that will neutralize the green. You know, don't panic if random things happen. You can see I accidentally picked up some red here, and I don't mind it actually. I really don't mind it at all. So I'm going to get a bit more of the yellow in there. What I'm going to do next is start at the top and work the other way down, so start putting some of these larger areas of cloud and shadow in and sort of coming down into this area at the base. So I've got some white here and I'm just working that soft edge of the cloud there. So just like watercolours, if you want a hard edge you need to be working on dry paint, and if you want a softer edge you need to be working into wet paint. But you can always, you know, if I want this edge here to be more blended, I can always put more of the blue in. And just working down, I've still got quite a lot of this colour here, which is still somewhat mobile. So I can use this actually for my cloud shadow, because I'm sort of staying within that limited palette. I'm gonna add a little white and a little water to blend with, and I'm just going to be building up my clouds. Luckily this area at the base is still somewhat wet, so I can start to work in some of those darker areas as well. Getting those little sort of soft curved edges, rinsing and even drying my brush when necessary. So I just want a bit more softness on the edge of this cloud. There's various ways of achieving it, but I'm just going in with a bit of a dry brush technique with this rough brush here. You can use any scruffy old brush. It doesn't have to be fan shaped like this. The fan shaped ones can just be a little bit easier to get a good result in. And anywhere that we want a little bit of soft texture, we could do some of this. And you can just play around with it until you're happy with the effect. I feel as well that this blue is a little bit too dark and stormy, so I've got some of the ultramarine and just mixed some white with it, see if we can get a little bit of a brighter effect. The problem with that, of course, is you can end up being too tonally similar to the clouds around, so got to just adjust there. It will dry slightly darker, however, and again, just gonna go in like this. Although now I've done that, I don't like it as much actually, so I think we'll go back to the old colour a little bit. This is the good thing about acrylics, you can just constantly adjust how things look. So I've played around with my sky for a while, I'm actually quite happy with that. There are some really distant, soft, sort of blue hills in the background here, so I'm just going to get a hint of those coming in as well. Get a bit more white in that. So what we're doing now is sort of coming forwards, we're working our way forwards because the trees are going to go on afterwards. Even those tiny little ones in the distance there are going to go on afterwards. Let's blend out some nice hills there. There's sort of a kind of a grey yellowish hill here, so I've just picked up, I'm just sort of grabbing things out of my palette here, and it's always a good idea to have more than one colour on your brush because you just get a much more interesting effect. This hill just sort of blends down into the first one, and there's some real light yellow in there as well, so I'm just going to grab a little bit of lemon and white. So when you rinse your brush, you want to sort of remove any excess water if you don't need it at that time, because otherwise you can overwater your canvas. I'm just going to add a bit more white to this and just blend it nicely in. You can't really see what's going on around here. I'm just going to take a bit of that white. I quite like this sort of mint colour here, so I'm just going to get a damp brush and just sort of blend that out. We've got some more sort of grey blue hills up the top here. I would say they're more blue on this side, so just a little bit of ultramarine and white over here. We'll put a touch of yellow in that as well because we don't want it to read too much as sky. We want it to look like a hill. I'm going to continue putting in these distant hills. Now I've just mixed a bit of the blue and ultramarine together and a bit of sort of muck from my palette, and just starting to get some detail on this distant hill over here. If ever you want to kill green off, just add a touch of red or pink and that will do it in no time. So just starting to get a little bit of stuff going on in this distant hill, and again I can just keep adjusting lights and darks, picking up a bit of white, a bit of red, and just keeping those colours in the distance there fairly muted because we're going to have these strong fresh greens closer in. Can you see how many different colours there are on my brush there? It's really helping me to get that natural look. Just like watercolour painting, you want to just let the paint itself do a fair amount of the work. So next we're going to look at the foreground, and the trees will go on at the end. So what I want to do is make a slightly warmer yellow for the foreground. So we've got the lemon up here. I've got this diarylite yellow. It's going to be a bit too warm, but what we're going to do is mix it with the lemon. So if I show you, it's a very orange yellow. It will look slightly less orange than that when applied. It's quite transparent, but I'm going to mix it with the lemon. We're also going to put some green out. You can see that the green by itself, it's too bright, but we can just mute that a little bit with some ultramarine. So here I've got a bright sunny yellow, and before we apply that we're going to put some more of the dark green in. So we're going to start building up these foreground textures, and I've gone back to a large brush, as you can see, because we want this to look really textured. So I've got some of the darker green here. You can see I didn't bother to clean my paintbrush. We've still got some yellow on there. I think that's too dark actually. Let's go a little bit lighter and brighter with that. So I've got some white and some green, and just adding these areas of green in. I still like this bright colour underneath actually, so I'm going to leave some of that showing through. What I'm going to do now is go in with some of this brighter yellow. I'm going to put some lemon on top. You can see how transparent this diarylite colour is. The thing to remember with paints is that even though acrylics are generally opaque and watercolours are generally transparent, it really depends very much on those natural pigments and what the properties of them are. So I've got a bit more of the warmer yellow over here. I'm noticing in the background here. Go in like this and going back to that brighter, more lemon yellow. We've even got some hints of brown in the foreground, so I'm going to introduce a little bit of red. Take that down with a bit of white. What I'm going to do now is get these sort of individual grasses growing upwards, so I'm going to change to a different brush. Now I've got a colour shaper tool here just because I happen to be using one. You can also use the end of a paintbrush, and I'm just going to get some little marks coming up like this. We are going to paint as well, but just coming up like this is going to really help to give these areas texture. Remember to make the marks smaller as they go up towards the top of the painting. You need to do this fairly quickly while the paint is still wet, of course. Even my paint is starting to dry already. It can be a great way of just adding to the texture of the paintbrush strokes. Remember, smaller towards the horizon, bigger at the base. Be quite random with them, trying to get them even like zebra stripes. So make sure that they go in different directions. It's starting to dry now, so I'm going to change to the other end, and I'm actually going to pick up some paint and start working in with my paint. I don't feel that's showing enough, so what I'm going to do is get plenty of white, mix it with my lemon. I'll assess as I go along, but it may be necessary to allow this area to dry. If I find that these lighter, brighter strokes are just not showing up, it may be that I just need to allow the first layer to dry so that these ones sit on top nicely, but we'll see how they look. Yeah, I'm going to let this first layer get dry before I add those brighter yellow highlights on top. So at this point my painting is fully dry. I actually left it overnight. It didn't need leaving overnight, but I was doing other stuff, so it got left overnight. I've pretty much mixed here equal parts of the two yellows, the diarylide yellow and the lemon yellow. I need that lemon in there, and also the white. I've put equal parts of those three in. I need those in there because they'll add to the opacity. I may use a rough brush in a minute. I'll just see how this starts to look. And already you can see that it's looking more opaque, and you can actually see these brush strokes. And mixed in with those scrapey marks that we made yesterday. That's the technical term for those sort of marks, scrapey marks. Sgraffito, let's call it that. Further back I might want just to get sort of the tip of grasses, so I could go in with this rough brush here. Like I said, you don't have to have a fan shaped brush like this. Any rough sort of brush will work, and I can get those sort of distant grasses. Really important that the marks in the foreground are bigger and taller than the marks in the background. I could also, if I want to, paint with this brush in the front. You want to be careful that you don't get this kind of yellow all over. I want to still have these darker areas showing through. So I'm going to go back to my original photograph and just look at where these sort of areas of yellow are and get them like this with the gaps of the green showing through. Now all I've done is added some ultramarine to my yellow mix, and I'm going to get some of these distant trees here. So these are not quite as dark as the ones in the front. I've also got some sort of lines of bushes and things going on back here. Just going to put a bit of detail in the distance and possibly a little over this side as well. And then we'll do those foreground trees. So we're going to do these trees now, and I'm going to do the foliage part first. And I've actually put some black paint out, which may surprise you, but you can actually mix a very dull green from black because it has so much blue pigment in. And you can see I've put some more of the diarylide yellow out. And you can also see that I haven't mixed everything completely together because I want variation. I want, as I dip my paintbrush in, for multiple colours to be picked up at once. And then I'm just going to go in by eye and just have a look at where we're going to place these trees. I'm using my fan brush again. As I said, it's not an absolute necessity to have a brush like this, and I'll use another brush as well in a minute because those are just a bit too rough and a bit too spiky. It can give you lots of tiny marks, which is really nice, but you may find that you have to go in as well with an ordinary brush and just soften in places. Adding some tiny darker details in places here. You can see I've gone in places with a little bit of blue and a bit of white, just trying to get a bit of structure to those trees. I've added some red to my palette now, and this will just tip some of this colour here into more of a dark brown. I'll add more black if I need to. I just want a really, really sort of neutral dark colour, and this will enable me then to paint the trunks of my trees. This will give us those final touches to finish our landscape. Do let me know in the comments if you're going to have a go at this tutorial or if you've done any acrylic painting before. And before you leave this video, don't forget to have a look in the video description. I've got all sorts of things for you in there. I've got some downloadable PDFs that you can grab for no money whatsoever. I've even got a free watercolor course that you can take. You can also find out about my Patreon membership and all of the paid courses that I offer. So this was a very simple landscape, but some landscapes can be a bit more complicated. If you're having a few issues with drawing landscapes, I've got a great video for you that will give you some really helpful drawing tips. You can watch that video right now.